So yeah, we're starting we're doing our podcast interviewing figures from the history of StarCraft. I'm Subsourian. I run the StarCraft wiki and a bunch of lore stuff. Mark is kind of the big community podcast person. We have a producer, folk singer, and legend of gaming history, Bill Roper. So welcome on.
Yeah.
Hey, thanks. This is exciting. I mean, you guys are doing good work. It's amazing that we're at that point, right, with video games where it's like we actually need historians.
Yeah, I mean it's been at that point now. I will say when I told my friend we were interviewing, he was like, "Oh yeah, Warcraft, StarCraft," and I said, and he also did Hellgate London. He said, "Hellgate London." I just went on a huge rant about how much they loved it.
Oh, that's nice. That's good to hear.
I love it when that happens.
Yeah, but so I guess we can start out. You were producer at Blizzard, I guess. Can you describe kind of your role going back to like mostly StarCraft, but I know you've been on since Blackthorn.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I started in '94, and I originally, the very first thing I did was as a contractor. I did music for Blackthorn for the PC version. And then while I was doing that as an external vendor, they were getting ready to cut a video that they were going to show at Summer CES. So this is pre-E3 when the Consumer Electronics Show was the only place where video games could get shown off. And they had this new game they were working on called Warcraft, Orcs and Humans. And they were going to show a video, and they needed to have a voiceover for it. So I sent a voiceover demo for some ideas on what to do for characters. And it was all cinematics, and that I went in, worked with Glenn Stafford, and this was back when there was, I don't know, maybe, 14, 15 people in the company, something like that. And Glenn's office was literally a closet that they converted into his space because it's the quietest spot in the building. And we had to sit shoulder to shoulder at his desk, and he had his desk in front of him, with a video monitor and a couple mics, and you have to turn around to use the mixing board, then spin back around to record things. And he had the video queued up that was a fly-through coming through these trees, and you came up to the front of this gate that looked like it was in front of a castle, and the door would swing down. And he said, well, here's what we're going to talk about, how there's orcs and there's humans, and they're fighting. I was like, is there a script? No, there's no script. So I just started writing stuff down really quickly. And that led to that in the age of chaos, two factions battled for dominance, right? And just throw all this stuff out about the orcish hordes and, the whole kind of very first threads of what would end up becoming all the Warcraft lore. And I always thought it was really kind of a fun full circle for that franchise, because the last line in the original Warcraft Orcs and Humans intro is "Welcome to the world of Warcraft." Yeah. And then later when we did the MMO and we were talking about what should we call that, I was like, we should call it World of Warcraft, and here's why. It's and it's just, it was the days where you got to just try stuff, right, and come up with ideas and do that. So when my contracts were finished, I begged my way into the company. I said, look, I'll do anything. I'll run community. Alan Adham, who's the president at the time, had bought a new car. I was like, I'll wash your car once a week. Magic the Gathering was brand new and super popular, and everybody there played it, and I was playing it. And I told Mike Morheim, I said, oh, Mike, I'll give you my Rock Hydra. It's just like anything. I just want a job here. So they brought me in, and that was my first as an official employee job, was to write all the lore and background in the very first Warcraft game. So they were like, there's orcs, they fight humans, and the bad guy's name is Blackhand. Go figure the rest out.
And now it's the most profitable IP, one of the most profitable IPs on Earth. So.
Yeah, it was just wild to think about, And we did Warcraft and Warcraft 2. And, we kind of got to the point where we knew we wanted to do more strategy, but everybody was kind of in that moment sick of orcs and humans and elves and dwarves and fantasy. And like, we got to do something different. So space, of course, was the furthest we could figure out, how to move away from that. And it wasn't originally going to be StarCraft, right? Originally, we thought, well, what could we do? Something in space that we all really love. So we actually reached out to Lucasfilm and LucasArts
about that.
and said, hey, we would love to do a Star Wars strategy game. And we had a lot of conversations with them, talked with them a whole lot, and got to pretty far along in ideation and what that could be. And we were really getting sold on the idea now of doing a space-based real-time strategy game. And then kind of infamously, Yoda's Desktop Adventures came out.
Oh my
And
gosh.
that, if you don't know what that is,
I do.
listeners, go look that up on the interwebs. Yeah, not the finest moment in, let's just say, game with kind of huge quotes around it development. And apparently after that came out, George Lucas said, whoa, we got to take a step back. Like, what is this? What's happened with all the licensing that's going on with Star Wars? So they had to back out of our licensing discussions. And at that point, I think we were very emotionally and mentally committed to doing something in space. So we said, well, we got to do our own, right? Let's go do our own thing. And I remember very distinctly sitting in Alan's office, and we were talking about what we were going to call it. And I was like, well, we had Warcraft. Why don't we call it StarCraft? And, I always love combinations of letters or numbers that are almost close to the same, of like some weird little puzzly trick things. And of course, the only difference between Warcraft and StarCraft is a W, an ST.
Yep.
So it flows through. Interestingly, we had to go through a little bit of a legal consideration because there was
StarCraft RVs.
Still is, StarCraft motor vehicles, like motorhomes, right? So the solution was that we had to capitalize the C.
Yep. I've talked to people copyright at Blizzard about that. It's like, you always put awesome. The C capitalized. Yeah.
Right. That's why that big capital C is in the middle. We started working on that, and I had done design and voice work, and then was doing production work at that point as well. So got to come into what I think eventually was a fantastic game. It really changed what real-time strategy was about in a lot of ways. Before that, we would always talk about how it was like chess. You had the same pieces on each side, right? But so it was how you use those pieces against each other. And StarCraft's particular magic, and I think still is having those three very different sides.
Yes.
Right. So you kind of have that rock, paper, scissor, probably Lizard Spock too, before we even knew that permutation. Yeah. And it really stuck, and it hit a lot of notes with people. Went through the phenomenon of becoming incredibly popular in Korea. Things that were really unforeseen, but the game took off, and I think that was, as well as and unexpectedly well as Warcraft and Warcraft 2 had done, StarCraft was really the big explosion that kind of launched the Blizzard rocket.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it was my first Blizzard title, so yeah. So I guess going back to the roots of StarCraft, I also know that it kind of took from a lot of projects that got kind of far but never off the ground. I was curious if you knew anything about, like, Shattered Nations was one that always interested me, of like a 4X that kind of never got off, but the Goliath model came from there. So if you knew anything.
Yeah, so I mean, Shattered Nations was actually my project. I was slated to be exec producer on that, so I was running that project, and we were building a turn-based 4X game. Myself and Stu Rose, who is an artist there, and Stu actually brought me into Blizzard, initially doing all the contract work. We used to hang out at a coffee shop in Long Beach, California, called Portfolio. And and they had this big butcher block pieces of paper, right, on the table. And we were just hanging out there. This is after I was already started at Blizzard. And we just started coming up with, hey, what would be a really cool 4X setting and game and thing? And I remember we wrote all the initial kind of thoughts and really rough 30,000 foot view concept of what that game would be and how it would operate on that Vulture block paper.
Oh, wow.
And then I brought it into work and was like, okay, so there's this game, and it was originally slated to be the first of 3 games, right? It was going to be a 4X trilogy. But the first one was Shattered Nations, and the whole idea was it was like a post-apocalyptic setting. There was kind of a blight that was going over the world, and it was like it was kind of designed to be like a civilization killer, right? That was the idea. This is going to be our Civ game. And you had to start with a small band of survivors, and then you'd roam and establish like a little village and a township, and eventually grow into kind of a power on the planet, right? And there was a Civ-like structure where eventually your big thing that you would do would be to kind of reach a certain technology level and win the game. And then our long-term plans is the second game would actually start from kind of the setting where the first game ended. And then you would go, and it was a space race simulation. And whoever could get into space first, right? Basically like kind of a global game into space. And then the third game was going to be more of a like another 4X exploration, but all between planets. And now you're finding other races and species and that type of thing. And we announced Shattered Nations. There was a video that got done for it.
Yes. That
went out on a demo disc. We had it up and running. There was a playable, basically, prototype. One of the engineers had spent a bunch of time and actually made like a working weather model. So we wanted to have this accurate weather modeling on the world because that was important for tracking where this kind of blight would go, right? And after how successful the Warcraft games were, and we talked about where, as a company, we wanted to go from there, we made a decision that we were only going to do real-time games, right? And in fact, that was a change that, kind of famously flowed into Diablo, which was also more of an XCOM-style turn-based affair.
Yes.
Up until we were like, maybe what would happen if we made this real-time? So that's the big thing that killed Shattered Nations, is we're like, look, we're building a Civ game. We're not going to do turn-based 4X strategy titles. So that went away. But we did. I think one thing Blizzard was always good about is if there were really good ideas in a game, they would get put on the shelf somewhere and used. There was definitely a couple things like that, like you'd mentioned, from that got put into StarCraft. As it is.
And I also wanted to ask, because there's been always a big community theory, because the StarCraft 1 manual is this big history of Earth that's kind of very similar to Shattered Nations. And I was always curious if that's true, that took elements from that to make that history of Earth.
Yeah, I don't know if that's the case. I mean, StarCraft was kind of, Metzen's first full foray into like completely running the world building. I did all of the original Warcraft 2, because I was moving much more into production. I handed off to Metzen, and he did, and I did like basically some like kind of background checking, and that was the more of like, wow, Chris, you're really talented with world design. Take the sequel for Warcraft. Which is really funny. The joke not a joke, but the funny thing about it was that when Chris was doing all the Warcraft 2 stuff, he kept killing off units that I had made for the first game, or games, or ones that were made that I had done, like the necrolites and these different things, but they were always like killed. They were destroyed, and so he got to Wolf Riders, and he was going to have them be. I was like, my only input was like, look, Chris, I think it's great. Like, you're cleaning some stuff up. It makes a ton of sense. Like, but if there's a unit that seemed like it was pretty cool, like maybe have them exiled, right? Or do like just have them gone, but you could pull them back. You could use them again. And I think those were the right call on those, because they were going to be really important as a part of the adventure game that we ended up not doing, but then kind of famously, made their way back in and later.
they became the symbol of Blizzard. That's a big statue outside is the Wolf Riders.
Yeah,
So
Wolf
maybe it's good they didn't kill it.
So I don't know. I mean, Chris would have to be the one to say if he was influenced at all by that background work that we did there, because that was really, that was just all Chris. Chris was like, I'm going to go off, and I think the only stuff I really did, in terms of any story stuff for StarCraft, was I was kind of his like very high level editor, right? So I would read it, and there was a couple times I remember where I was more feedback like, hey, Chris, I read this. This seems really cool. But if I didn't know the whole story, I wouldn't know what this meant. Right. It was like, which is always good. Like, that's just a little editing nudge. But, I claim no creative push over any of, that lore. So, Chris would have to tell you whether any of it was actually influenced by what we did on Shattered Nations.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And also going back to the Lucasfilms thing, this one's more for, I think I know the answer, but this one's more for the audience. There is a common myth that StarCraft was like that you approach Games Workshop for the 40K license. I'm pretty sure that's not true, but is that not true?
No. Yeah, it's not. Yeah, we never did. I think that I think a lot of games get influenced by what people read, what they listen to, what they watch, what they play, right? Probably not surprising. A lot of like Warhammer and 40K players, in the company at that time.
Yeah.
And I think that if there was, a single biggest inspiration, it might have been that Samwise really loved exaggeration, right? I think that's the thing that's really cool about a lot of the Warhammer stuff and 40K stuff, right? So you get the big suits and
big pauldrons.
Big pauldrons, right? And I think that he really loved that silhouette that could give, right? But yeah, our licensing discussions got fairly in depth, as I said, with Lucas. And then when that didn't work out, we were like, okay, what are we doing? Let's just make our own world. So that pretty much is where we just flipped over and started building our own universe and all that good stuff for StarCraft.
And if I remember, you were also previous licensing deals with DC pretty burned a lot of the company to licensing deals.
Yeah, they definitely, when I started there, they were wrapping up a couple of other projects, and in fact, how we met the guys at Condor that would become Blizzard North, do Diablo, is that we were both studios were working on Justice League games, right, like fighting games. And yeah, there's kind of that, I'm sure at this point, kind of, famous story of our conversations at Blizzard with DC about Superman. And that was the thing, that Superman doesn't kick. And we're like, here's a multitude of film and comic and television examples of Superman kicking. And they were just like, yeah, Superman doesn't kick. So that tends to burn you out on like, what if we just make our own stuff? Then we can decide if somebody kicks or doesn't kick.
Okay. Well, cool. And before we move on to StarCraft, I do have to ask, because you were in the band, the Proxy Bogards, kind of a folkish band, right? And
the Proxy Bogards got started. I started that with my college roommate. And same year, I started at Blizzard, so 30 years ago now. We started the Bogards. They still perform. I don't really play with them much anymore. I lived in London for a couple of years in Washington State, so they're very much a Southern California-based band, so it was kind of hard to go out and perform with them. But they're still going, still doing albums, still performing, still doing gigs. And in fact, in Warcraft 2, when you click on the church, there's this like Deo Gratia that is on there, and that was an arrangement. That was a little chunk of an arrangement that the band did for a song called Agincourt Carol. So we were coming up with what sounds do we get when we click, and just in there with Glenn, I'm like, oh, we can have like a little churchy sounding thing. Like, oh, I know all the parts. I'll just do this real quick, right? And laid that out. So they're always thanked, like in I think all the games when I worked there, the band's in there. They actually kind of, interestingly, when I was at Disney many years later, and we were doing the Pirates of the Caribbean play set for the first Disney Infinity, we had a lot of challenges getting all the music rights for Pirates of the Caribbean. And so they had to write a bunch of like sound-alike music, and they were still a track or two short. And so I said, hey, I can grab a couple people from the band and we can take one of our original songs and strip the lyrics out, because the band's pretty blue. Can be, we do traditional stuff, but we wrote a lot of things that were for that, that naughty stage. Not really what you're putting into a kids game, especially. But we, Stu Venable, who I started that band with, and myself, and at the time his wife Heather Green, and my wife Elspeth, we all went in the studio and did a like stripped down all acoustic non-vocal version of one of the Boggart songs and put that in there. So we actually got a Boggarts tune in a video game eventually too. But
part of the Disney canon.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, now it's just in there. But yeah, we that was the kind of thing, is I always tried to find, and I still do try to find ways to cross-pollinate all my interests.
Yeah, there's a story on the wiki we have, because they cinematic artist inserted from your song "Happy Jack's Undrinkable Ale," but because it was not 1998, the undrinkable was a blurry red, like it was 400 by 800. You couldn't read it, so the wiki listed it without the undrinkable, and then we found the song and we were like, well, do we fix it? And it turns out writers had taken the just Happy Jack's Ale as a thing in books until like the remastered version came out, and we could finally see, oh, there is a little undrinkable there. Oh,
that's funny. That's really funny.
So yeah, it lives on as a lore debate.
It's great.
So okay, going back to kind of the dev of StarCraft, very famously, there was the Warcraft 2 engine days, the Warcraft but purple days, which got kind of, how far along did that get before the whole Dominion Storm remake?
I mean, the thing that was great, is we had the War 2 engine. It worked super well. It did a lot of stuff at that time in history that we were told, people didn't think it was going to be possible. Like, you can't move that many pixels at one time, and how can you have that many people playing together over local area net, right? And so we're like, oh, this is great. We can move right into development on the next game. We've got a great engine. Let's use it. But it supported a pretty specific art style. So the first thing we did was like, well, let's go build some units that have that look and that feel. It was up, it was running. We started having base mechanics in it. It was great. Like, we had a shipping engine we could start actually, building assets for, and really rapidly getting to being able to iterate against gameplay. And then we took it to a show, and people were like, what is this? This is terrible. It's orcs in space. It was really interesting how that art style became so connected to the Warcraft universe, even through the engine. And that was when we came back from that show, and we're like, we have to write a new engine. We have to be able to do a lot higher fidelity graphics, right? Not only is that where that's the industry going, but it's got to be something that separates it out from the Warcraft universe. I think that was the thing too, is even just when we did that, thinking about how we would adjust, the camera view, led us to not have things be as exaggerated, more photorealistic in that way, in terms of proportions and the angle we had where you were looking at units and controlling them. And, since we were then building a new engine, it let us do a lot of things that we probably would have never done if we would have stuck in the War 2 engine, just like number of units you could control and some of the schemas that we built in terms of being able to support new gameplay mechanics. And certainly we would have had to rewritten all the network code that we did at the time when we started. But yeah, it took us, getting it in front of people. And I think that's something Blizzard was fantastic at, was that we would always, once the game was a certain point, we would get it in front of people. We would take it to shows. And the company was still of a size where we could take pretty much the whole company to E3, for example. And everybody had to work the booth. But then part of that was, we want you to directly the reactions of people playing the game, right? And we would always come back from those shows with just reams of notes, and it really, I think, made the products a lot stronger, because we weren't doing in-office testing. We didn't have, here's a testing suite where we're behind the two-way glass and we're tracking eye movement like everybody does now. This was literally like put it in front of some gamers and then watch what they know how to do or don't know how to do.
That was the day of the freeware disc in the magazine. Just like get
Yep.
feedback from, we got to physically give it to you.
Yeah, exactly.
That's so cool.
Yeah. So the one thing, as a big fan, I'm curious of. So a lot has been said on StarCraft 1's, like the vanilla game's history, getting that set up, the panic of it. But Brood War, the expansion, has been just complete black box. There's no concept art. There's some, but no one really talks about it. And it was 8 months from start to like release. Can you speak to kind of that time? Was it its own chaotic mess, or because I know you were executive producer on that project? So.
Yeah, I think the reason that Brood War was so fast, right? Why there wasn't a lot of, like, to your point, concept art generated and because it was all the things while we were building, and kind of the opposite of that for StarCraft, right? StarCraft was long and oh my god, what a grind, especially at the end. And we kind of like at one point threw out all the Protoss art, right? Like it was just such a long grind of development, but we came up with so many ideas that we eventually couldn't do. So, and that we really like. So those things just kind of got set over here. Like, oh, this is going to be this is expansion. And you always do that when you're working on a game. Like, this is such a really good idea, but God, this is going to be the sequel or the expansion. Just, we can't get it in. And a lot of the StarCraft Brood War stuff was that, right? From unit types to how we might balance things. And so we'd already done that concepting or given that thought process to it. And by the time we got done with StarCraft and we're moving into Brood War, it was like, well, we kind of know where we want the story to go. Chris already knows where he wants the story to go. We already know we're going to, what medics are like. But hey, medics are the Terran unit, the Marine, but with different paint job and, different deliveries at this late. So it was almost like it was just tribal knowledge that was already there or stuff that was written up in a GDD someplace. And so we already knew what it was going to be. So we could finish StarCraft, take that quick breath, and then it's like, okay, let's go make this next thing. Like, this is going to be great. Like this add-on is going to be awesome. Because we kind of already knew we wanted to be. And then we could, while we were building that, track what that initial, probably 4 to 6 months of player input was, right? And see like what's working, what's not working. We were helped incredibly by watching the kind of explosive competitive play that was coming out of South Korea, right? And paid a lot of attention to that and looked at where are the holes, right? What's working
fix
and
the
not
beetleless, fix the beetleless problem.
Yeah, exactly. And then so like, okay, well, how do we plug those, right? Like, well, how do we do that? And I think that was the big thing. Today StarCraft might not have, the Brood War might not have been, a released second expansion. It would have been like, oh, we flowed this in over time, adding units, tweaking things, but that's just not the way the process worked then. And we were just really driven to get out these changes and fixes that we knew we really wanted to do, but we were like, oh, we've got to ship this StarCraft thing. At some point we've just got to be done and ship it. Mm-hmm. And it was really interesting. I mean, StarCraft was almost at that time in Blizzard development, aberrantly long to make, right? I mean, the original Warcraft, Orcs and Humans shipped, and then Warcraft 2 shipped in like a year. It was really fast, how fast it came out. And then StarCraft took a long time, but then Brood War was out really quick. And I think that was more the pace we were used to keeping. StarCraft, we were just doing so many new things that we kept running into the problem and having to change those. But then I think also a big part of that was, that game would have never been what it was without all those wild changes we made. And the balance was excruciating on how long it took to even get it as good as it was with StarCraft. But, I don't think that ever really stopped. Like, I don't remember there being a big pause between StarCraft and then Brood War coming out where we were still not just constantly testing balance and how to make that work. And then when we started getting, for us, like an unimaginable amount of data from people playing, right? And I think that was the other thing, is that we could do a lot of in-depth analysis because we had that ability in StarCraft to basically record a game and then play the game back to the engine. So we started seeing, oh, here's this game where this tactic got used and it was super, powerful. Or people were saying like, Mutalisks are really overpowered, right? Or there's this exploit that people are using. It wasn't anecdotal. We could literally get the game files and play it back and see what happened, and then use our tool set to say, oh, here's where this is happening. And last thing I'll say on that, I think, which really helped it, was just how active the community was, right? Amazing community of people playing it on our forums, talking about stuff. I mean, sometimes they would offer the suggestion to, if you guys just make it where, you add 1 point of damage every other shot that the Terran Marine does, that'll fix this thing. And it's like, yes, and then there's all these ripple effects you don't understand, but we get what you're saying, right? Like, get to the core of it. This is the challenge that players are having. So, I think all those things combined for us to just take that quick breath and hit the ground running to work on the expansion.
A tradition of community feedback, thinking they know how to fix the game, has lasted to this day.
Yep.
But they know something's wrong and they know where it's wrong, right?
Yeah, that's always they say. They know where the problem is, not the solution.
Right.
Yeah.
So I mean, you kind of touched on the fact you kind of knew going in with Brood War where it was going, and I know you're not as much of a, like, you touched on a little bit of the campaign, but not. I know you weren't as big in the lore, so I don't know if you'll know, but initially with pre-release materials, it kind of implied Brood War would be a different story. Like, oh, there's a coup in Manx ranks. They're going to rebuild Ire. And then the game is different than, like, you can still even see in some instruction manuals that it mentions that different story. I was curious if there was a shift to halfway through on anything like that.
I mean, I don't really have that finite of a memory of that. That might have been where, as Chris was going through it, he was writing that and then realized, like, oh, this isn't gonna be as good of a story. I'm gonna write something better. But it's also a challenge to go through then, and scrape all those things out, right?
Yes,
Like, oh, wow, I forgot to take that name out, or we forgot to take that little reference out. And those become the nooks and crannies of lore where people are like, oh, it's like almost like the fun Easter egg discovery of, what was that? What were they really going to do? Like, where's that weird piece of artwork? What is that? What was that from? Right? Because you just can't get everything.
Yeah, and believe me, it causes many. I call it a video game religious war. Arguing over those tiny things that get put out.
Which is all fun and good, usually.
Yeah, I mean, I will just say that we, as developers and having done a lot of lore and IP building, like, we care immensely about that stuff. And also, two things: one, we are not perfect, and two, we're probably not as smart as you give us credit for. A lot of times you just stumble into something, you're like, oh yeah, that's it, that's great, and then you just forget there was this whole other idea you had that somehow is still stuck someplace.
Mm-hmm.
I think the particular genius of very good lore creators, and then people that, especially when you're taking on and continuing worlds and stories and characters that became as epic as the StarCraft stuff and the Warcraft stuff, right? In scale and in scope, is being able to go back and look back on it and, like, almost posthumously tie things together, right? So you come up with ideas and everything, and there's these threads in your building, and then you get later, you're like, oh, this actually make sense if I tie it back to this thing, right? And you have that benefit of kind of like looking back, right? And then you can do that, and then at least, like, oh my god, the geniuses!
They planned it all.
They thought about that. So, that was the whole, when we got to World of Warcraft, it was like, we have to call it, that was my thing. I was like, we have to call it World of Warcraft because it was the last line in the first game, and somebody's going to see that.
It all.
Their minds are going to get blown. So I think that happens a lot as well, and that is where paying attention, when you're writing or taking over that lore is so important. And it's what I think it makes it so interesting and exciting for people that really follow that, right? That are really into that, like what you guys are doing. And why I think it's super important. while I was at Blizzard, one of the big things I pushed for was I said, we don't know what this company is going to become. We don't know what is going to happen with these worlds and characters we're creating. We should save stuff because maybe someday we'll want to look back on it, or maybe someday it'll be really important to people. And so I was that guy walking around the office like, hey, make sure we keep a copy of the boxes. Make sure you put this thing in here. Mike, we need storage space to put this stuff into a closet, And a few years ago, when they were, I can't remember which Diablo anniversary it was, but like I went down and Brevik went down and we, interviewed for some stuff for a thing they did for BlizzCon. But Mike was kind of giving me a tour, and it was during I think maybe the 20th anniversary for StarCraft or the 15th anniversary of StarCraft, but they had a bunch of StarCraft stuff out, including the disc that went to space, and a bunch of other stuff. And actually meant a lot to me. Mike said, we would never have this kind of thing or the ability to do this if you wouldn't have bothered us all those years ago about keeping things, right? But I was, maybe it speaks about to the fact that I like to keep mementos. Like I like to keep things that remind me of that. And it was like, I don't know. I just always felt like Blizzard was going to be something big. And it was like, we should keep all those things. There's just somewhere have that stuff.
You're speaking to someone whose basement is a StarCraft museum with employee stuff I can get. So that speaks to me a lot.
Yeah, I feel like I should send you guys a bunch of my StarCraft stuff that just sits in my garage.
I would be honored.
I've got like I think I even have some of those watches we did at one point.
Oh my God!
You saw those.
I have exactly one of them.
So. Yeah, I think I got like 3 or 4 of those. Like, but just like again, things I just kept right. And now in life, it's like I don't know, they're all in the garage somewhere.
Yeah, we have
like
a big
display.
display.
Like backpacks with weird plastic hard shell backpacks made at one time. Blizzard backpacks had like a tail in the bottom. That for snowboarding.
I might as someone and I have merch questions later about it too.
All right,
I'd love to hear all about that. But
I think that's something that video game creators are suckers for is physical stuff, because what we do is virtual and digital, right? And so if it gets to a point where somebody makes a thing, it's like, oh, that's awesome! Somebody made there's a physical thing.
It's real.
Yeah, like I can hold it. This is so cool.
So it's not kind of a sillier question when we were doing preliminary research so we were going through the roles, and Wikipedia has you cited as the caterer for Brood War, in spite of that not being, we checked the credits, we checked the manual. I can't find anything on that. Is that actually?
Yeah, that references that the caterer. That's funny. That references that I used to make food runs, and especially like soda runs at like 3 a.m, right? Like that game was fueled on so much liquid carbonated caffeine. It's ridiculous. And there comes a point when you're producing, no matter the level you're at, but when you're on the production side of the fence, where you can't do anything to get the game out. You're just like, like I've greased all the wheels. I've given everybody all the tools for success they need. I've done everything I can do. Now, like you're coding, you're hunting bugs, and so you start, you kind of flip over into cheerleader mode. So it's like, hey, how's it going? This is great. What do you need? I'm gonna do things. Do you guys want sandwiches? I'll go get those. So who needs? Well, like, we're gonna try to do one more build. It's 1:30 in the morning. We're trying to do one more build. All right, I'll go get Cokes for everybody, right? And so yeah, we used to. I think that's where that, as memory serves, was just the fact that I was always up, no matter what, up for going and making that that run at whatever in the morning.
So did you do the Chinese lemon chicken recipe that got snuck in the game, or is that?
No, I think that was Mickey.
Oh, okay.
Mickey Nielsen. It was either Mickey or Sammy. But I think that's one thing I loved about, especially those days at Blizzard, is we were always just like trying to find silly stuff, just goofy stuff to put in there, to just. Sometimes it was fourth wall breaking. Sometimes it was just like, we got to sneak this in there. That's that was the whole where all the pissed sounds came from.
Stop poking me.
Yeah. Like in the original Warcraft, we were just there and I was recording lines.
Stop poking me.
Yeah, stop poking me. And I would, I'm recording with Glenn and we're doing all that. And he's like, I was like, hey, what would happen? Like, because I noticed from playing that while something was building, I would just absentmindedly click, like click, and wait for something. I was like, what happens if we kind of broke the fourth wall? And if you just kept clicking on a unit, it would acknowledge that. And it would get like upset that you were clicking it. And so Glenn was like, yeah, let's record some. And which is why they were pissed, right? Because they were like, stop it, and then we did those and we're like, okay, we got to get him in the game. So we went to Bob Fitch. We're like, Bob, can you put these in? Here's how we want them to work. And he's like, yeah, no problem. And so they went into a build, and then that build just got distributed, and everybody's playing it. And in the early days of Blizzard, we had our own like virality test, right? If something went viral, people were in their offices playing it, and then somebody would get up and they go to someone else's office, and then they play, and then they both get up and go to someone because they were showing them this weird thing they'd found, right? A bug or something fun. So it wasn't like everybody emailed it out or something. They would physically get up and go and show someone else, and they would go show someone else. And after, I don't know, like half an hour, 45 minutes of the first time that went in, Alan came out of his office. He's like, okay, who put this in? What is this? And so he explained it, and everybody was like, this is awesome, right? And so it just got left in. And that kind of became a hallmark of the games. And I really love that they would always do things like that. Right, find different ways to put kind of funny things in for people to find, and a lot of times too is just to break up the stress and pressure of making the game. Too.
Something fun.
One of my favorite pissed quotes, I think you did, for the Vulture. I don't have time to fuck around. It's the most.
Yeah,
it made me laugh so hard because you actually censor it in the game.
Yeah, that's where we were starting to be like, oh, let's start pushing it. Let's have it where people are going to know what that word was. I mean, we can't actually do it, right? But yeah, and a lot of times too, those they started out where I would just make them up off the cuff, and then as we got into War II, and I wasn't the only voice actor, we're like, we got to start writing these out, and we would always let people improv lines too. And then by the time we were getting into StarCraft and Diablo and all like War III and everything, there's so many characters and so many lines, and we'd actually have a writer's room where we'd be like, oh, okay, so here's going to be this unit, and here's what they're like, and here's some art, and here's the lore background, and it was really, it's really funny to think about that now, where it just started with like, hey, let's just do this thing, it'll be funny, this is kind of what they sound like, I'm not giving any thought necessarily to what any of this means, right? Like I didn't sit down and be like, oh yes, Dabu means I obey, but it was just like all, like, okay, I'm going to make some funny orc sounds, right? But then by the time we got into StarCraft and, like in the later games, it was like, no, we got to write these out. They've got to be in the spirit of who that character is, right? So when you hear
Chris have a fucking Protoss like language library, or what have you guys? Do you guys have that somewhere?
I'm sure there is.
I'm sure there is too. It's just
early on it was just all the orc language stuff I did was completely off the cuff, and then you'd write it down afterwards, and be like, oh, okay, well, yeah, this kind of, because it wasn't like it meant these words exactly. It was more like, oh, this is an acknowledgement that the unit's been sent. Okay, I'll say a thing like that. This is a I acknowledge I've been selected. I acknowledge I've been sent someplace, right? It was more functional, but you wanted to have something that evoked the spirit of the character. And StarCraft is where that really started to get pushed, right? So I am sure someplace Metzen, that they created, whether it was him and Mickey, or the end of the folks that did a lot of the writing for the voiceover actors specifically, you have to start building a Bible for that stuff. Right, especially the more important it becomes, right? But it's really interesting to look at that, because StarCraft is where the conscious decision was made of, hey, all the units, a lot of the units on screen are going to be represented by vehicles, by non-humanoids, but it's something that doesn't look like a person on the screen. What are we going to do? So that's where that idea was, when I click on a unit, no matter what it is, there's a relatable face portrait that comes up, right? And it's like when I'm choosing the Vulture, right? Like I don't see a picture of like a cool motorcycle thing coming up. Like I see the Vulture rider, right? It's why the medic is there and not the ship, right? And things like that. So I think that was a big thing for us, or not the medic, but the transport, right? Like impact,
Yeah.
right?
It's so funny you say that because in StarCraft 2, it's they combine those two exact units into the
They do,
medevac.
yeah.
Yeah, right.
That's why I was like, wait, does he know about a medevac? What? I'm pretty sure you weren't in Blizzard by then.
I think that was just them like trying to get to an evolution of like, well, maybe that started being the next thing.
It was just a funny coincidence.
It's always an interesting mix of, you know, what's going to drive the lore and how it's going to support the game mechanics, right? And that and how those operate together. And you're always making decisions on that and moving things around. And well, maybe this should work this way and that should work that way. But you know, we definitely got to a point where all that stuff had to get written down. And I think by the time, you know, we were in StarCraft and in Brood War, we were starting to realize that there was a lot of what we were writing, and though we cared about the lore, we didn't know if anybody else would. It started to become pretty apparent that a lot of people were starting to care about it. So like, oh, we better be more thoughtful about it and maybe like actually write a bunch of stuff down that we've just been doing. You know, and Chris was great at that. You know, Chris is a fantastic lore spinner. So I would not be shocked at all if somewhere he does not have some sizable Protoss, you know, dictionary at least.
Sure, he does.
He wrote it down and now it consumes my life. So
Yeah.
So, speaking to your voice work, I know Mark really like his focus is a lot doing a lot of the voice acting. And there's always been a lot of confusion around it because StarCraft just has a list of voice actors and not what they did for the credits. But you're obviously Fenix, which is probably, I mean, aside from the orcs, your most iconic. I think that's the one people know you for. But I think you did the Vulture, Goliath, and the Cerebrate Zasz. Was there any other that you remember?
Yeah, I mean, those were the ones. It's really interesting. So. You know, Mark and I have had a lot of conversations over the years about, you know, who did this voice stuff. It's a big mystery. And so before this recording, we were chatting over email. I said, hey, who have you talked to and haven't talked to at Blizzard already about it? And so Mark mentioned a couple people he hadn't got a hold of. I think one of the things that was great about the old Blizzard days is that, you know, a lot of us became friends inside and outside of the company. So I still know Tracy Bush really well. In fact, he was a Poxy Boggart for several years. So I reached out to Tracy and I said, hey, I got a list of characters that are kind of like uncredited or questionably credited. And can you clear up who they are? And so he said, yeah, let me go back and look at my files that I still have. So I at least have some answers.
That's good. Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe we can finally get two Stukov ones.
We can finally attribute some of these. So Dagoth is a big one, right? We talked about that. So that's Metzen. That is Metzen.
That is Metzen. Okay.
That is Metzen. Okay.
Yeah. The number of voices on that list that are Glenn Stafford is pretty impressive.
Yes.
I was assuming.
Right. So Glenn did the Protoss Advisor.
Okay.
Glenn also did the Archon and the Dark Archon. Trace about 90% sure Glenn did the Dragoon as well, the base Dragoon.
For some reason, I used to think you did the Dragoon.
I did not. I did. We talked about that. And he was like, "Hey, I know you did Fenix, right?"
Phoenix
and he was like, "He goes, and I thought you did the Dragoon as well." He goes, "But I went back and listened to it, and I know it's not you, right?" And he goes, "I guess I'm pretty sure Glenn did the unit because we wanted to make sure that the hero stood out and wasn't the same voice actor."
Yeah.
Glenn also did the Zealot and the Zerg Advisor. So that's the big list of the Glenn voices.
That is huge because so it's long been asked because there's the Overmind and Aldaris, who are separate voice actors, but in game everyone just assumes, oh, that's Paul Edig, whoever the Colonel from Vulture.
Yeah. But
so this just
not.
confirms that they're separate, which that's
Yep.
been a 24-year mystery.
Let me clarify just real quick, just to make sure. The Zerg advisor is not the Overmind. It's a different voice.
Zerg advisor was on the list you gave me, and that's what he looked up.
No, that's okay.
That's probably like when you're in the game and getting
sorry, I just want to clarify because I know that again you're not that versed into the lore, but the Overmind is credited to be voiced by Jack Ritchell, and he's the
I think the advisor is different than the Overmind, right?
Yes.
Okay.
And
just
that's
like it's like the Dragoon is different than Phoenix, right? Like the Overmind was more of like a named role, right? Like an important one, where the advisor was like the in-game.
But that confirms a lot.
I just had a thought. Does this mean that Glenn was the one that sang the Overmind song in the files?
Radio Free Zerg.
Radio Free Zerg? Or was that
him? I can try to find out. It might have been. It's possible.
Well, if you find out, email me. So.
All right, I will. I absolutely will.
Okay.
So let's see. High Templar is Jason.
Jason Hayes.
Jason Hayes. The Dark Templar, Tracy was like, I don't have it written down and I can't tell. The Reaver, I thought was interesting because he had this written. He goes, with the Reaver, we just took some random vocals and put it through a comb filter combined with the 6000 series SFX behind it. Like, he knew exactly how they did the Reaver sound, but it's all just like random vocalizations they grabbed from
with the beeps.
Yeah.
I assume the Reaver and the Shuttle were both like
and and the Shuttle is also just like a complete SFX, right? Sound effects thing. The Scout is also Jason Hayes.
Okay.
The Infested Terran is Paul Sams.
Really?
Yeah, so that's who did the Infested Terran. That was Paul's big, I want to do a voice thing. And I remember this. As soon as he said that, I remembered Paul was like head of biz dev for us at the time, right? Paul and I were like VPs together, and we used to travel together and became really good friends, working there. And I as soon as he said that, I'm like, oh, God, right. I remember there was that time where Paul was like, I want to do a voice in the game. I want to do a voice in the game. And so they're like, all right, we'll find a character for you. So that was the Infested Terran.
Is he the only guy that Paul did?
I think that's the only person Paul did.
He knocked it out of the park. It's a very iconic Live for the Swarm.
He could not figure out or find out who did Stukov. So that is still a mystery.
Sorry.
But I can clear up the Terran Medic 2 voice we talked about.
Okay,
please do.
So that's Tiffany.
Okay, it is Tiffany.
It is Tiffany. And he said, and this is what he said. He goes, regarding the Glynis Tiffany Medic thing, he goes, Glynis did a first pass, but then we changed what the medic was saying, and they couldn't bring Glynis back in for another session. And Tiffany was there. Like, Tiffany worked there, so they were like, they had Tiffany come in and do it. So that's why there's confusion, because Glynis originally did a recording for it, but then they went through again. Like, that's the thing, right? What units do change, how you need them to react change, based on things, and so you'll do a lot of line rewrites, which is why it's interesting. You always have a lot of Or used to at least have a lot of in-house people that could do them, because then you could come in at the last minute and be like, well, you got to get back in the booth and change all your lines. Like, not have to just try to book someone and are they available and like all that stuff.
I just had that come up in a trivia contest. So
right. That feels bad because I feel bad because I personally talked to both Jason and who is her husband and Glynis before, and I know Glynis was really torn up about not being let back for StarCraft 2. But and she had told me that she had recorded for the medic in StarCraft 2 as well. Interestingly, but yeah, that is that scenario you just told me about, that actually makes perfect sense, because like in my mind, I knew they're not lying. They both believe that they are the medic.
Sure,
And,
yeah, and they both recorded the
Yeah.
lines, right?
That's very interesting.
And that, I mean, it's really interesting sometimes, just even its availability. I mean, when we did Diablo 2, right, and we had Frank Gorshin do Marius, right, for all the cinematic sequences. We brought him in, and when he auditioned, when we talked with him about it, he didn't really audition as Frank Gorshin, but when we talked about it, his voice had this really specific raspy quality. If you go back and listen to those cinematics, right, him narrating all that stuff, it's like this really specific sound. And it was because he had vocal nodes, and he was going in for surgery, and we're like, we have to get everything before he has surgery, because once he does, it's going to clean his voice up.
It'll be different.
And he might not be able to replicate that, right? So sometimes you're on these very bizarre timelines, and he was fine. It wasn't like we're like, come work in pain for us, right? And he was like, it's fine, I can talk, it's everything. It just is affecting my voice, right? And we're like, well, actually, we think that sounds really freaking cool. So if you could come in and do that, we'd love to get you before you go get fixed up. So I remember there was a mad scramble to get him booked before he, went in to have those nodes removed.
I am curious about two more things about voices before we move on. The civilian. Did you find out who did the civilian? I'm assuming
I did not. I did not. Okay. It's almost like Glenn or Jason's a good placeholder, right? Because would tend to happen is you get to a point you're like, you could select civilians now as an example. Sure, this is what happened. You can select civilians now. Okay, well, we've got to give them something, right? We can't have them be a unit that doesn't say anything. Okay, let's write some stuff real quick. Who can jump in the booth and do something, right? And you're like, you're not going to go hire an actor to come in, right? You're not going to get a talent like Linus, for example, to come in and do that. You're going to be like, okay, let's just fund somebody around the office that can do it.
Yeah.
And that's why you start to see like, okay, Glenn did, like, here's the next other 5 voices Glenn did that just kind of got locked, and Glenn's not there. Like, I got to make sure I've got my IMDb page set up where this is listed, right? It's like,
oh yeah. And also
his name appeared a couple times. It's fine. We don't need to break it down so much.
You don't need to worry.
Right. Yeah, no worry. I'm writing all this down, and
I'll email it to you as well. So you
please do, yeah. Yeah, like I remember years ago, I heard it, like I saw on one site, IMDb, it said that the scout was Matt Sammy or whatever, and I saw that on behind the voice actors, it said he was Glenn Stafford, and then there was like on movie games, it said somebody completely different as well, and shit like that. Like nobody knew, so I had to start reaching out to people.
It's the kind of thing too where I mean, like, in a lot of ways, in the mid to late 90s, it didn't mean as much, right, as it does now, right? Like we were at the point where like everything was non-union. You were just like grabbing people in and bringing them in. Unless I think that was around the time it started to become a bigger thing, right? Like, hey, we got to find like really good voice actors, like really good actors to come in and do these things, because it's going to start meaning a lot. And especially when we were doing units, right? It's like, it's on the screen, it's this big, you're clicking on it. Like these aren't characters that have, so many of these never had lines, right? When you got to see things like, like Zasz or Fenix or, Stukov or Dagoth, like when you had named characters, then I was like, okay, we need to have someone that we know can actually, deliver those characters and do those lines. And then those became, you were more careful about noting who those people were. Then it was just like, we got who's gonna do the scout? We gotta have somebody do the scout. Okay, Jason, get in the booth. So, now of course, every single thing gets noted. So we're a lot better about crediting people, as an industry now, at least in that terms. You know, and I think that's really important. You know, like crediting is such a big deal because a lot of times that's what people can take away from it, right? Like if you're in the industry and on a team and making something, no matter what you're doing, you know, there might not be, you're not getting that notoriety or a bonus or whatever it is at the end. Like you've come in and done your job, but like you want that credit. You know, like I always hate companies that don't put people in the credits because they weren't on the team when the product shipped, even though maybe they worked on it for 3 years. Like just put it costs you, it costs us nothing to recognize their contribution, right?
Yep.
And it means everything for them to be able to, not only for the sake of their resumes and portfolios, but for their friends, be able to say, yeah, I worked on this thing. The number of movies I've sat in afterwards. Here's an example. I was in a different band I used to be in called Brazil 2001. We did kind of like a surf and turf type music. You know, we used to always say it's like Jimi Hendrix meets Don Ho, you know, and we actually had a song that appeared in a movie called Chairman of the Board, which is not good. You look that up. It was a Carrot Top movie back with Carrot Top.
Oh, wow.
But our music, like we heard it, they're like, "Oh, this is going to be perfect for this thing." And we were in the theater. We, you know, me and the other two guys, the band, and we watched this whole, not my favorite movie. And we got to the end, and literally there was probably about maybe 15 people in the theater, and we were all watching through the credits. And they're like, "Oh, that's it in there!" Like it were all people that had done something in the movie. It was really funny, right? And so we were like, "Yeah, there's us." You know, the band name went by and stuff.
Even when it's a stinker, it means something to you that you.
Yeah, it doesn't matter, right? And so, like, that's the whole thing is, you know, and especially if a game comes out and it's really good, you know, or maybe it's like it doesn't sell crazy, but like it kind of doesn't matter, right? It's people have poured their time and their lives and their creative effort into these things. Like the absolute minimum we can do for those people is credit them for the work that they did.
Speaking of credits, just shout out to Tracy W. Bush, who helped us clear up a lot of this cast today. So
heck yeah.
Thank you. So
Tracy's another one of those I keep a bunch of stuff nerds. So I knew if I reached out to him,
I'd love to. Just getting to talk to you alone. So yeah,
I would love to have him on someday. I know I used to talk to him on Twitter that he took down. I don't think he took down his Twitter, but he hasn't been on in years. So if you can get me in contact with him, I'd love to invite him.
I will at least make an intro.
Sure, thank you.
Appreciate it. So I guess looping back, because I know your role as Fenix is probably, like I said, one of your more iconic voice roles. Did you have input on the character, or was that kind of a role you slotted yourself into? And
no, I mean, it was, you know, when we went through, just because of my position there, you know, and I was definitely like, oh yeah, I definitely want to do voices. And it was like, yeah, doing unit voices, that's really cool. So, but, you know, we're going to be doing even more extensive kind of in-game cinematic storytelling, right? Than we did with the Warcraft games by having those kind of extended, I don't know, in UI scenes, right?
Yeah,
like not even just like the cinematic sequences, but in the context of within the game. In having that those characters interact with each other, right, and do storytelling through the missions and doing a lot more of that. So it's like, oh, I really want to do a couple of those characters. It was interesting. Like we talked about different ones, like who wanted to do which characters. And I said, like, I really want to do like kind of a skeezy, you know, Zerg character, which was Zasz. I always thought of him as like the third tier guy, the one who was like basically figured out how to like connive his way into that council, right?
Metzen even wrote that as his character.
But then Fenix, you know, one of the characters, and then my mental approach for him was Falstaff. And I'd always wanted to do this like really big, like braggadocio character, larger than life, you know, thinks of himself as very heroic, whether he ends up being or not. And so, you know, I said, yeah, I really want to play this because a lot of the Templar were coming out and the Protoss, like the Templars, I think were coming out very very heroic, very paladin-like, very serious in some ways. And I was like, I kind of want someone who's a little more freewheeling, a little more almost lighthearted, right? And so it was like, oh, this is great. He's a Dragoon. He's a different. He's not the Templar, right? He's got this other energy going. So, from that standpoint of how he got approached and how I approached playing him, I had a lot of input.
Okay,
that's awesome.
And also, so Fenix, there's a rather famous hidden voice line for Fenix getting jiggy with it. Is there a story behind that, or?
I mean, that was like the product of the time, right? Like,
yes,
was listening to,
I assume
we were all listening to Will and everything else, and it was like, sometimes we would just do goofy stuff. Like you'd just be in the booth and you would just throw out goofy stuff. Like you're warming up, or you're just saying things. And you would just be like, oh, I'll just say this thing. And then someone usually ends up just cracking up, and they're like, okay, I'm clipping that and saving that somewhere, right? And sometimes that would be just to like pass around the office for fun, but sometimes it would just find its way into the game somewhere, or sometimes you'd use things. This would happen on art, especially. Things would get used as a placeholder, and then it doesn't get scrubbed, and then people are like, oh, what's this weird block with Sammy's face on it? Right? Like if you find these weird things, what is that? Right? Why is that in there? And the getting jiggy with it line was definitely me just riffing on something, talking in the booth that they're like, okay, yeah, that's pretty funny.
Having fun with it.
It's so cool.
So, actually, yeah, I'll jump back to Fenix. I know you have some more questions, Mark. But did you have any involvement in the? I think I saw your name credited, the StarCraft 60, the Nintendo 64 port of StarCraft, or?
Yeah, I was some flavor producer on that.
Tell us about it, please.
That was a really interesting experiment. Could we take?
That's a good way to put it. Experiment.
Could we take our stuff and put it on consoles, right? And I think that was Nintendo became a partner for us to do that. We're very clearly going up and visiting them in Seattle, right? Going to the Nintendo offices, which is like, oh my god, first time I'd ever been to Nintendo. I was like, oh, this is amazing. And talking about like, hey, could we take some of our games and move them over to console? Because the Blizzard's roots are on console, and we were always trying to figure out how to get back to console after the PC games started hitting off. I don't really know why, but we did, and there are some pretty famous failed experiments, in trying to get back there, or projects to get there. But this was the thing where it's like, oh, hey, we really want to do this. And Nintendo was game for it. They were like, yeah, sure. Let's, and it was the 64 their system was out at the time. And there was a lot of hard work to get it to work on there, not just from a standpoint, but the fact that the input is so different. Right. And probably the single biggest thing we changed, to the two biggest changes to the way that the game operated, I think, to get it onto the 64. One was creating a way to select all like units.
Yes.
On the PC version. So you're like, give me all the workers, right? Give me all the Templar, right? Whatever it is, right? Give me all the Terran Marines, which was just necessary to be able to do mass unit movements. And the other one was automating harvesting. And we found that to be so hard. Like it's such on the PC version, it's like such a kind of a core, like physical loop mechanic, right? Like you're moving and it clicks, like it moves and it just kind of becomes part of the base maintenance zen that you get into. And it was impossible with the controller. Just like going and making that finite. The big thing was like if you had to select a unit precisely using the joysticks, right? And they're always kind of moving around, and super easy if I just got a mouse because it's such finite control, but really, really hard on the controllers. So that led us to being like, well, what can we do to make that easier? And it was the realization of, look, the AI already does this, We just need to let the players use the same AI. And the way that they're influencing the AI mix is how many worker units they make, right? So the game isn't how do I select it and move them here and there. It's more what's my total balance of working units to, military units. And I think those like that changed specifically later than flowed into War 3, right? Where War 3, used that same type of methodology. But yeah, it was really fun. It was amazing. Nintendo also, for them, it was kind of an experiment. It was like, hey, can we find PC games that do extremely well? Can we make them work on our console? Like maybe it's another place we can reach out into. I don't think it worked out perfectly for everybody involved. But it was pretty neat. Probably one of my specifically fondest memories, a memory that sticks out, is when we went up to Nintendo, we met with them, we talked about it, and I think there was like 4 of us on the trip that went up there. It might have been like me and Paul and maybe like Mike and somebody else, I can't remember, but we went up, and that was when Nintendo owned the Seattle Mariners.
Oh yeah, yeah.
It was that time period. And so we got into their meetings and everything, and they said, we didn't tell you guys, but we're going to take you to the game tonight.
Wow.
Like, I was a huge baseball fan. I'm like, oh, this is awesome. My guys, is great. Them taking us to the game, they owned the team. So we've got to go to the owner's booth to watch the game, which we didn't know that was going to happen. Totally unexpected. I'm just excited because I get to go see a baseball game. And then here we are in this like mega luxury suite right above home plate, right? It's the owner's booth, and we're in the like food laid out everywhere, and it's like, oh, this is like one of the greatest days of my career. Watch a baseball game.
I'd forgotten about that. Yeah.
Yeah. It was pretty nuts. But it was really it was fun working on that project because it gave us challenges to try to solve with something that we knew very well with the game, right? And we're like, how do we try to replicate the fun of this experience in a completely different environment?
Was it a Nintendo mandate to kind of scrub the swearing? I've always just been curious about that because
I think we did. I'm sure when we looked at that, we're like, hey, we better. It's Nintendo. We better clean it up. I don't think that was necessarily them telling us.
Okay.
Might have been more us like going, that's probably not a bad idea. I'm sure that there was discussions, with them. And we went through everything and we're like, okay, what's in, what's out, what works, what doesn't work. And that very likely was just a mutual on the list point. I don't have the memory where they were like, you guys need to do this. I think it was more like, hey, we should probably do this, right? And they were like, yeah, that'd be a good idea. Okay, cool, we'll do that.
Yeah. So, and I know you're a big tabletop, so I've always been curious. You're a big tabletop gamer. So were you involved in the alternative like StarCraft like board game? Or the table, yeah.
You're muted, Phil. I think he's talking to someone.
I think he's looking for it.
Yes. You're muted, buddy.
Sorry, I didn't realize I was muted. Yeah, I was. In fact, I was just looking on my shelves earlier to see if it was around here anywhere. Yep.
Nice.
There we go.
Yeah, there we go. Because I remember you do a lot of tabletop stuff, so I was curious how involved in this you were.
Yeah, still do. Yeah, no, I was super involved in this. This was really fun. Worked with Bill Slavisek and Richard Baker on it, right? And this was like the 2-game deal we did with WotC, right? There was this in the Diablo set that we did as well. But like I always loved that we had like tabletop RPG, no computer,
not a computer.
Yeah. Right, like, hey, yes, it's StarCraft, but this is not for your computer.
Don't put it in your computer.
That's funny.
That's right. Funny. Yeah, it was because this was like their space RPG they were pushing at the time, right?
Yeah.
And we're like, yeah, we'll do that, but like we also want to have Diablo and D&D, right? And they're like, that's great. Which
that's great, but
yeah, that's great. No, but we got to have a StarCraft thing. I don't have the Diablo stuff around because I actually a really good friend of mine who's a streamer, a D&D streamer, hit me up for it last year because he was like, hey, I want to do a charity D&D stream with around Halloween. So I said, hey, let me send you my Diablo, right? You can do a 5e conversion of it, right? And then have me on the stream, we'll play. So he didn't get it done last year. We're going to do it this year. So I don't have my thing somewhere also, and probably about getting up and looking around and think about it ahead of time. We also did figures.
Yes, I was about to ask about that.
There you go. You got
They never released and they never connected them, but I was going to ask because all we have is the prototypes. I had to get these from someone's wife was selling stuff.
Yeah, I think all we ended up doing for those, I don't know if with those was the prototypes. Like that's what I have is the same thing in the baggies, right? We actually did Diablo ones that we actually sold physically in the boxes, right? So all we ended up doing on StarCraft was the prototype stuff. If they're not here in my chamber of secrets somewhere, they're out in storage.
If you do find them, can you check the Firebat out? Because we have a big collectors community. Every version we have found is missing the arms on the Firebat. Someone even showed us the template where they had the mold. Couldn't find the arm holes on them. So
that's funny. I will look now that I know to look for that. I'm just still kind of like glancing at my shelves on where those might be, but I think I put those in like my deep storage.
I'm gonna share my screen real quick right here. There were a couple of action figures that were going to be released. There's a Kerrigan right here. There's a Zeratul, and there's a Ghost. I'm wondering, do you have any of these, or
I don't. The one thing I have, which is not StarCraft, but you have to deal with it anyway.
That's all right.
All right with me.
Is whoops. Hang on. I swear to God, I'll be back on camera in a second.
You're good.
So yeah, that was when we started doing. We were starting to do figures, right? So I've got my Diablo figure still.
Oh yeah, I've seen that one.
Right. So, but then we were starting to do the StarCraft ones as well, right? The reason I always kept this one is because I also have this one, which is
a prototype,
a plastic prototype, right?
That's
where
beautiful.
they try different types of plastics and color code them because these are, they're more bendy, so they don't poke your eye out, right? Same thing here, but then these are harder, right? And this is the hardest of, or the like this. These are the hardest or something, right? So they would give them different color coatings.
I love
the tests.
I almost got one that prototype for the Firebat figurine y'all did, and I lost that auction. So I tried.
Yeah, there was definitely like some of those really like I don't have any of the StarCraft figures, but we definitely started. That was the thing that was fun because a lot of that was us just like finding someone to do it with, right? Like we want there to be these figures. We think it'd be really cool. Not like we were getting approached by Hasbro. We were like, we're going to go find someone to make these for us.
And I know Korea got their own brands too and all that. So,
and that we really got pushed a lot out of South Korea as well too, right? So when the games started really taking off there, especially StarCraft, there were so many just like merch opportunities that started cropping up, and then it became like, okay, well, what are we going to do? What are we not going to do? And it is the kind of thing where I kept a lot of stuff, but I would probably have to have a second house if I actually kept everything that flowed through there. I literally have boxes in my garage, and it's one of those things they call, why did I do that? But where I have certain games where I've got like every language ever shipped in box. And it's like, I don't know if anybody really cares, but at the time it was super important to me to make sure I had,
Yep.
Awesome.
It is by the mercy of
language version box. There's not even games in it. It's just the box.
It's by the mercy of my wife that I am able to have the collection I do. So I'm. Oh, go ahead, Mark.
I was just gonna ask about the voice actor thing real quick before we continue because I forgot a couple things. Do we know who Alan Adham voiced, the producer guy? Do we know who he voiced?
I don't know who Alan voiced.
He was credited in both the first game and as well as the Brood War. So whatever it. So I was thinking it might have been Dark Templar.
I mean, it might have been, right? It's the kind of thing where at some point, I mean, Alan was the president of the company at the time, and at some point we might have said, like, Alan, it'd be really fun. You should come do a voice, because Alan was never. He was always very much behind the scenes, right? He was never that. He never wanted to be in front of press. He never wanted. It's the reason I did all the press, because when we started on the original Warcraft, and he was like, "Hey, we're gonna have to start talking to press about this and talking with, with people outside the studio." He's like, "I don't want to do that. Are you comfortable doing it?" I was like, "Yeah, that'd be super fun. I love talking about games." So that's how that got started. But I'm sure that we were like, "Come on, Alan, you got to do a voice. It'll be really fun. It's cool. You're just in the booth. It's all good." So yeah, I mean, it could have been, but I don't remember who it was.
And then last for what I was thinking right now is Glynis. I was gonna bring up her voice thing for the medic. She's told me before, like one of the things that she said that was kind of proof that she thought she voiced her was that she remembers playing the game and finding it weird hearing herself die. And I'm wondering if chance that they kept her death sound in there.
I mean, but they might have, right? Like that wouldn't change. That wouldn't require necessarily a re-record, right? So, I mean, there's some potential that they might have had, they might have said like, "Hey, we've got to re-record all of Glynis's lines." They had Tiffany do that because they changed what the medic was saying. But then they were like, "Oh, well, hey, we've already got good death sounds and stuff, and it's similar enough voice-wise. No one's gonna, no one's gonna be like, why did you change voice actors for the death sound?" No, I don't know. I don't know if that's fact. Is it possible? Yeah. Sure. But even point, I don't know if anyone would remember that level of specificity.
I don't know if anybody would either. But
people tend to recognize their own voice, right? So if Glynis is like, like it's really weird. That's not me doing all that other stuff. I remember recording stuff, but that's not me. But that sounds like me doing death, right?
That's what I'm thinking. Is it's either that or she's talking about Kerrigan's death sound, which is admittedly really hilarious.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Like it's really over the top. So a lot of the death sounds in the game are really over the top, and I love them.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing too, right? Is that I think that was always a kind of a fun thing for us. We're like, oh, it's the little unit on the screen, right? Like,
it goes big plot of
you
blood.
always want the funny, not funny, like the big sound, right?
Bombastic.
Because part of it too, right? The other reason is the other thing is not only are they there to provide character and drive storyline, but they're there as an actual like game mechanic cue for players, right? So, like if you look at StarCraft's a great example of this. Like when you select a unit, right? There's a visual representation on the screen of the selection of the unit. You see like a little or you send it someplace, you see it, right? Sending's the best example. I've got a unit. I'm like, I'm going to send it here. On the screen, you see a burst, right? Like a toast. It's like it shows it's moving there.
Yeah.
The unit immediately starts moving, even before it knows it's pathfinding. It starts to move, right? And then there's an audio cue where it's like roll out or whatever it is, right? And it starts moving, right? So we've given you triple confirmation that the command you've given has been accepted, right? And audio is always a big, huge part of that. It's one of the reasons actually. It's one of the reasons I'm gonna say I don't like mobile games as much, but that's not kind of a misnomer. It's one of the things I miss about mobile games. Because everybody just turns the sound off. And you miss so much. There's like so many cues you can give people. So kind of like a lot of those over the top death sounds are because that's an important thing that a player has to know, that a unit's died. And especially because it's very likely you're not on screen when a unit might die. Right, it could be off the screen. So we would actually, a lot of things were proximal, right? Like it would be louder if you got closer or where they were placed. But as I recall, we would always kind of play the death sound like front and center and at a specific volume. Yeah. So even if it happened off screen, I would hear, and you're like, oh god, something died, right? Because we want you to be able to track what's happening across the game, and audio is such an important way to be able to do that.
Yeah. So I wanted to go on to so StarCraft Ghost is probably one of the most famous vaporware projects now that Duke Nukem Forever came out.
Yeah.
I was curious if you had any. I think it's mentioned you've had some involvement in it, and if you had any stories about it.
Yeah, I mean, StarCraft Ghost was like one of those great ideas that suffered from just like constant shift in attention and expectation, right? So as I said, we were always like, God, we want to get back to console. We want to do a console game. We want to do a console game. And the opportunity came up where we're like, hey, we could do a StarCraft console game, but not a strategy game. Like, let's do a game set in the StarCraft universe, right? Let's branch out what StarCraft is about and tell some different stories with StarCraft. And so there was a great team available to do co-dev with. Ray Gresco and the guys up in Washington. And we were like, okay, yeah, this is great. Let's do it. And the first problem I think that happened with it was that all of the most experienced leadership people, we were all on other projects. And so we're like, hey, we've got to start spinning this up into like ideation, right? We got to, is there a there? What do we do? Like, let's try it. And so we found kind of like what we hoped might be that next generation of leads, right? Or leads moving up to, senior and exec and that kind of thing, and said, hey, we want you all to drive this, right? So kind of the first mistake was not having, someone like me or Sammy or Metzen or Alan or Mike or Frank or, Pat. I think Pat was gone by then, but like, having someone who had taken games, all the way from inception to delivery, heading that project, right? And look, third party was hard enough anyway, right? We sucked at third party, and I was the director of third party development for a while, and we sucked at it. We had one big success, and that was Diablo, right?
Yes.
We acquired them after.
And then you ate them.
Yeah, we were like, hey, you guys, we really love you guys, and what you're doing is amazing. You should just be a part of the company. So, that was challenging enough. Trying to do something historically the company wasn't great at, with people who had just never been put in that position before. So what that kind of led to was, the team was building some stuff, and it was really cool. And we had early builds, that were, I remember like the first kind of big playthrough type thing we had was you were playing as a ghost. I don't know if we had her actually named yet. I don't know if it was Nova yet or not, but you played as a ghost. And it was like this huge battlefield of all these Zerglings coming in. It was basically Terrans defending against a big Zerg rush, but in this like 3D, third person shooter type setting. And you run down these trenches and you get into different stuff, and you had to go up and you manned a gun at one point. We're like, oh, we want to have people like in there using that. And then the whole idea was you had to get to a certain space, hold it, like distract them and hold it long enough for the Terrans to get out, and then you called down a nuke. That was like the whole, here's our cool, sweet, proof of concept.
And a build of, I don't think the nuke happened, but a build of that actually did get leaked. That was a press build.
Right. Yeah.
Recently,
yeah. I think we like didn't put the nuke in yet, but that was always the planned like ending. Like, oh man, we got boom, it's awesome, right? Then it goes to logo or whatever, right? So we built that, and it was in, and we're like, hey, this is pretty cool, right? How's that going to work? And then kind of what started happening is that, and this is where things just started slowly going off the rails, was a new game would come out, and the team would go, oh, you played that new Metal Gear game, Metal Gear Solid? That's amazing. We got to have Ghost be like that. And then some other game would come out kind of in the same broad genre, right? And the leadership team would get excited about that. They'd be like, "Oh, we got to add that in there," which is why you then started seeing like kind of radically different presentations of StarCraft Ghost, right? There was one where she was like stealthing her way through the interior of some complex and like stealthy, like that was very Metal Gear driven, right?
Metzen said it was 3 different games that they packaged together essentially, and that's
why. Yeah, and it just and so it kind of went on, and then it got to a point where we got to one point, and I was up at Blizzard North by this time, and Blizzard North offered like, hey, we could take a look at where things are and at least offer some suggestions. I mean, where things were. And so we did that, and we were like, hey, this is kind of a hot mess because there's just like, it doesn't have an identity, right? Based on, and that's where, now pressure started to be like, oh, what is this game going to be, you guys? Like, what are we doing? And so, I remember Brevik made some pretty like, hey, I think you should do this, and this with it. Those things didn't necessarily come to be or anything, but like now basically higher level leadership was starting to, like say, I have an opinion on what this should be. And then other products in development got to stages where, then it was like, okay, Metzen's going to move on to this project. Right. And I think that was a huge shift that was kind of that first death blow for what Ghost could be, because Chris came in and the team, the developer was working on it. I mean, look, candidly was getting yanked around, right? They're just like getting told, make it like this, make it like that, make it like this. And they're doing their best to deliver all this stuff, but they had always kept pushing through the same storyline, had built out assets, had actually started building cinematic sequences, right? The whole thing. And then Chris came in and Chris was like, basically, I hate this story. Right? This is terrible.
Oh no.
Story. And Chris is like, I'm rewriting this whole thing. And I think at that point, like I might have been gone by that point. I think we'd already started Flagship at that point. We got a couple people from that team because we knew they were really talented. Jason Felix was one of them, an artist who actually had worked a ton on all those cinematic sequences. And then when they came in and said, "Yep, we're just throwing all that work out," he was like, "I can't be here anymore. I can't. Like, I gotta go." And I had heard through some of that he was on the market, and I'm like, "Oh my God, we need an amazing artist. Will you come work for us at Flagship?" But and so they went through a big reboot, right? And then they ended up moving it to they started working with Swing and Ape, I think it was. Yep. This is all after I was out of there by this time. And then like moved it there, and then they tried to do stuff, and then they made a big push, right? And it was at E3, and they've got, they had the costume that they were wearing, and my really good friend Jessica Drew like took a bunch of photos in it, who's an amazing artist, right? And also does like incredible cosplay and stuff. And so she was super excited. I remember her saying, she's like, "I have to wear the Nova costume." I'm like, "Oh, that's amazing."
I've seen those. Yeah, they looked really good.
Yeah. And so they made a big push, right? They had a big presence at E3 one year with it. And then it was like they acquired Swing and Ape, and then they just got like absorbed like the Borg into World of Warcraft, like everything else that Nailed Down did.
I'm told WoW came out and everyone's just like, well, we'd have to make it a third time for the new generation. So at that point,
yeah. So then it was just like, okay, like forget it, right?
Yeah.
We got put on hold or whatever. It's it disappeared. But it was I still think like the core idea of extending the StarCraft universe into having a main character based off of one of the unit types, so like would be phenomenal. And it just was just one of those unfortunately terribly troubled productions that, unlike some other games that got canceled, that one just like kept going and going and going and going.
Yep, forever. And everyone, I had a Toys R Us pre-order for the GameCube version. That version got canceled before anything.
Yeah.
So I guess I'll do 2 more, and then we'll kind of go into the post Blizzard. I don't want to keep you too long.
Sure. Of course.
So were you Phoenix's death was kind of one of the more memorable moments of the first game. Were you involved much with that? Did you help write his death and those lines, that kind of stuff?
No, I mean that's all Chris, right? You know, but Chris did talk to me beforehand, and he was like, "Hey, this is going to be like a pretty big story moment. You know, I'm really hoping to write something impactful. You know, and I think that was the thing. You know, to me, StarCraft was because of just like the contained story that was there." Right, the twist, the massive twist that happens halfway through the game. I want any spoilers. Arrogant happens, right? When you've got the Queen of Blades twist, like just like things that were totally unexpected, and just like so many like earned emotional moments, and like Fenix's death and things like that. Like Chris just did such a great job with that, you know. I wish I could say like, oh yeah, you know, I wrote all that because it's amazing, you know. But you know, that was me just having the privilege of getting to you know actually act those lines that were there.
It is a very quoted performance, so you definitely nailed it.
Oh well, thanks. Yeah, I mean it's easier when you've got great stuff to work with, you know, and just like. To me, that's still, even with everything Chris has done over the years and stuff, like I still think StarCraft as a package of storytelling, you know, the first game is so remarkable.
And I guess one more merch question that you might know. So I don't know if you knew about, there was a deal with Blizzard with the skate company, I think Veriflex, that briefly they were going to produce things in the Warcraft 3 era. I somehow dug up a prototype of the Fenix
the
one.
Deck, yeah, the StarCraft deck. Did
you know anything about it?
You got one of those. That's amazing.
Yeah, did you know anything? I found this. The guy said he worked for a Blizzard archive. I don't know the history. I don't know if you knew anything about that deal.
Yeah, no, we this was when we were like, hey, we got, you know, we think that the games are blowing up, the worlds are kind of big, you know, we want to start doing merch. We want to have a lot of stuff out there. And so, you know, a lot of that got driven by what was either, you know, like what did gamer nerds love doing, or what was kind of adjacent to it, right? And there's a lot of guys in the office that skateboarded, and they were like, oh, we should do decks. We should do some decks with the company, right? And yeah, there was like, that's so funny. I remember there was a StarCraft deck and a Warcraft deck and a Diablo deck, right? I think.
Yeah, the Warcraft 3 got like 5 of them, but I didn't know if they had because they said this was a prototype. I didn't know if the StarCraft
they prototyped different decks, right? And then they ended up doing a deal where they did a bunch of War 3 decks, right?
Okay.
And I think that made sense because War 3 had the box art, right? It's so funny if you go back and you look at the boxes, like the evolution of the boxes up through like into WoW. Right, it's like Warcraft vs. Human is like 2 people on the cover facing each other, and then War 2 is like they're a little closer to the camera but facing each other, right? And then you get into StarCraft, and we have like there's 3 boxes, but each of them has a full face, right? Yeah. And then Diablo's like got a full face but pushed a little closer until you get to like World of Warcraft, which is like a half a face, really big on the bottom. You just get pushing the camera in closer and closer.
Just
an
eye eventually,
an eye eventually. But it's I'm kind of looking up at the upside because I have a piece of art I have up it's a 3-up, like a Triskelion of the StarCraft boxes.
Yes, and if you match them, the background ones.
Yeah, it's the sheet, right? So that we did. So cool. But I think that, you know, that was a time where we still had enough like kind of say and drive in like what merch could be, right? Because we were still in control enough of our own fate in that way, right? It was still early enough in the merger chain, right? You know, where someone could come up with a really cool idea and it'd be like, oh, let's see if we can go make that happen. You know, I mean, I'm sure talked about it at this point and stuff, but even when we did, you know, the first game, we did the original Warcraft, you know, there was 2 things we wanted to do in terms of even just packaging that we got a lot of pushback from Davidson and Associates on. One is I did all the manual stuff and the layout and everything, but then I had worked at Kinko's Copies. That's where I came from before I came into games. And I said, hey, you know, there's like paper types we can get, that will like look like parchment inside and then have like this kind of fake leatherette, you know, for the cover. They're more expensive, but like they're gonna look really cool. This is when manuals, you want your manual to look really cool.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Yeah.
And so, and I wanted to do the tricky like Ode to Mad Magazine thing where you read the humans one direction, then you flip the manual over and read the orcs the other direction.
That'd be cool.
And you open the center and it's got the map. So that's what the original Warcraft manual is. Right? But that was the printing was fine. That didn't matter. That was just me laying it up that way. But getting that paper and that extra, like, 2 cents per cover cost or whatever, right, for that paper was a big thing. And then Alan's big push is he said, I want a notepad in every box. And sales were just like, do you realize how much it's going to cost us? Like 5 cents, 7 cents a box. Plus it makes it for shipping costs increase, right? The whole thing, like, why would you do that? And to me, it was genius. He said, when someone goes into the store, they're not going to know what Warcraft is. They're not going to know who Blizzard is. It's our first PC game. Maybe they played our other stuff. Maybe they played Lost Vikings or they played Rock and Roll Racing. But, this is a new audience for us. And if they go in and they're like, what are these 2 games? And they're in the stores and they pick up each game, they're going to go, whoa, this is heavy. This has got to be a better value. Completely psychological.
Yes, it is.
And it makes total sense when you think about it. Yeah. Even though it's just code. At that point, a lot of like discs, 3.5 inch discs too. But a completely psychological thing. We used to, and if you find any of those running, we're like, they had the phone number for the offices on it because that was our helpline. Call us.
The tip line, 5 cents a tip.
It was literally just like one of the office lines. And it's really cool that sometimes we would get sent. We would get sent things on the pads. And I think the one that I remember the most is at one point we got a letter back in the letter days that came from these game developers. And they were like, hey, we thought you guys would think this was cool. And we sent it to you. But when we did the original like design concepting for our game, like what's it going to be, we actually wrote it on the Blizzard pad.
Oh, that's cool.
And that game was Team Fortress.
Wow. Okay.
Whoa, awesome.
These guys like sent us their original, like, oh, here's going to be this. And it's like, it's the super high level ideation stuff, right?
Yeah.
Right. They were all playing.
I'm a huge Team Fortress fan.
Right. And they were just like, oh, man, I'm going to write these ideas down.
That's what they had.
It came out. It was so huge. Cool. Everybody loved it. And they just sent it to us. Right. And it was like, whoa, that's insane.
That's crazy. It's a
and I am hoping that somewhere they still have that. That immediately was a thing. It was like, oh, we have to keep this forever.
Yes.
I mean, who knows? It was like 4 pieces of, notepad paper. God knows what happened to it.
You'd be surprised what people keep. So yeah.
Yeah, very true. That could be somewhere in the archives, someplace.
Yeah.
So I guess leading in because you kind of touched on it a bit, was you founding Flagship and kind of the more pressure you were getting from during the merger. Can you I mean, obviously not any disparaging way, but speaking to Flagship.
No. I've been at Blizzard I was at Blizzard for 9 years. And by that time I moved I was originally from Northern California. So I moved back to Northern California. I was working with Dave Brevik and Erica Mack Schaefer out of the offices up there. And it was this time where, because of all these mergers that had happened and different things that occurred, we went through the HFS CUC merger that created Sendent. And then that ended up being one of the biggest fraud cases in America at the time, because HFS and CUC, when they merged, to be technical for 30 seconds, when they merged, it was a merger of equals, which meant that they had like almost equivalent earnings. And so they created a merger of equals for those companies, which created Sendent. The problem was then later when the SEC looked into it, they found out that one of the groups, I think it was CUC, but one of them, I don't want to say it incorrectly, one of them had cooked their books to make it look like they were equals when they actually weren't, because that gave their executives bigger compensation packages when the merger occurred. So we were, all of the execs at Blizzard, we were on an executive retreat where we took 4 days, and we were like, okay, we need to get out of the office, away from everything. And I think we were in Mazatlan or something, and we, at a hotel, and we were going to go out to dinner, and we all went to Alan's room because he was always last. He was always like the slowest, getting ready. And we're like, come on, Alan, let's go. And he has CNN on his television, and the Sendit logo comes up on the screen, and we're like, oh, they're talking about Sendit, which is like our parent company now at the time. And then fraud comes over the top of it. And we're like, what is it? And we turn the volume up, right? And literally all of our stock options went from 52 to 7 overnight. Right? Everybody's underwater, right? None of us now, anything we've built, personally in terms of stock holding over the last, at that point, 7 years or something, all gone. And that led to a lot of pressure. They had to divest. Then that's when Havas Interactive came in, that later became Universal as they bought more stuff, right? That whole era of Blizzard's history. But we just, now at this point, I'm at Blizzard North, and what we kept seeing was basically Havas, which was the parent company that, ended up buying Universal and everything, but they were getting pressure from their shareholders, and they were like, why are you buying all these media companies? They were literally a water company, and that just went on this multimedia spree, bought Canal Plus, Spotlight, all these different things. And so Jean-Marie Messier, who was their CEO at the time, was under immense pressure on what do you do all these things? So we start hearing all these rumors of oh, they're going to sell off all these companies. They're going to sell off Sierra and Blizzard, and because they had all these, and we were all part of that package. And we didn't know if we were going to get spun off, sold. They were just going to sell our IP. They were going to, just close everything down. We had no idea, and we couldn't get any answers. And so Dave and Eric and Max and myself at one point just said, look, we have to understand what's happening. We can't effectively run the studio here because everyone every day comes in and they're like, I read this thing in the Wall Street Journal. I read this thing in the San Francisco Chronicle, whatever it was. And there are all these rumors flying around. Do you guys know? And we're like, we don't, because no one's talking to us. We don't know. So the four of us wrote an email to Jean-Marie Messier and the board at Havas and said, look, we want to be included in these conversations. Give us a phone call, send us an email. We can offer you guidance. There are companies, we've heard rumors that you're thinking of selling the company, right? There are publishers, if you sell them to, 90% of people in this building are going to walk, right? And all your value is going to go out the door, right? And this whole thing. And we said basically, look, if you don't talk with us, we have to leave, right? That was our big. This is a president and 3 VPs, and we're run the Diablo franchise, and it's okay, we were so adamant about it that we did that. And literally over the weekend, we said that on a Thursday. Saturday, Morheim calls Brevik and says, okay, so I heard from the guys in France, and they want us to come accept your resignations, and you're out.
Wow.
And so we were like, well, that's kind of unexpected. That wasn't actually what we wanted to have happen, but okay. So we all came back. We were all, the four of us, just happened that we were all out doing different things in different parts of California at the time. We all come back. We meet at Eric's place and start talking about well, what are we going to do? How are we going to handle this? What are we going to do? And we go back into the office on Monday, and all the brass from Blizzard down in Irvine show up, right? PR, HR, Mike, Alan, Paul, everybody's up there. And as people come into and our main conference room was a fishbowl in the kind of near the center of the studio for Blizzard North. And so as people are coming in, like they see all the people from there and they're like, oh my God, we got sold. There's a merger. Something big happened. Obviously, why would these guys be up here? They're never up here, right? And then we close all the shades in the room and everybody's like, so everybody's freaking out because we haven't told anybody that this is going to happen. And then we're like, look, this was actually the intent and the whole thing. And it was basically like, okay, it's done, just a done deal, guys. It's just the way it's what's going to happen. And we had, conversations with them about what that meant. We all did exit interviews, and it was really weird. And, at one point they kept asking us, they started asking us like, well, who do you think should run the studio? Because basically all the studio leadership's going out the door.
Yeah.
And they would bring somebody up. They're like, well, what about this person? And so we would say, well, here's the 3 really good things about that person, and here's the 3 big challenges you'll have with that person because of inter-office politics or all kinds of stuff. Because you could do that with anybody, right?
Yep. That's any work.
And after about 2 or 3 of those, it kind of dawns on them. They're like, oh, this is going to be a lot harder than we anticipated, right? And I had always been the liaison between North and South. And so I had all the relationships, right? And I was managing that both when I was down in Irvine, and then I did it from a different location. I was in Blizzard North. So they didn't have those relationships with anybody other than Dave, Eric, Max, and myself in the studio. And I'll never forget this. At one point, they were basically like saying, like, you guys should tell us how we need to, like, what we need to do in this regard. Like, who should we put in there? And Eric, I remember, said, at this point, we kind of just view you guys as competitors because we're going to go start a studio. So you can go figure it out.
Jeez, yeah. They just fired text from a boss after they just fired you.
Yeah, right. Like, hey, could you stick around and do replacement? So we then we have a meeting. We're up in front of the entire Blizzard North teams, and we're like, tearfully telling everybody, like, it's been amazing. You're all fantastic people. It's been an absolute honor to work with you. I mean, this is the company that Dave, Eric, and Max started, right? But we're all leaving the company. Right. Like literally going into my office and clearing out stuff. And, my office was a shrine to the company anyway. I had so much stuff. And I'm like, I was not planning for this. Do we have boxes anywhere? Like, how do I get all my stuff out of here? I even remember telling Mike and Alan saying, like, look, if this is what happens, right, you have to issue a press release. You're part of a publicly traded company now. You can't have 4 executives walk out the door without there being a press release. We would like to write that press release with you. So it's a mutually kind press release. Said, but I am telling you, I will get calls from the press because I'm the person who's dealt with the press for the last 9 years. And they all know me personally. And so that's what happened, and it was Kurt. Oh, I can't remember Kurt's last name now. But he wrote like one of the biggest non-gaming, like magazine gaming columns. Like he was with either New York Times or Wall Street Journal, or he was with legitimate mainstream press, not PC gaming, right? But it's big news. It's a publicly traded company, and so he called and talked to me, and I agreeing upon how we had agreed to talk about the exit, did all that. And it was really funny because he said, so what are your plans? And we had not premeditated this. We had talked about it literally right after we realized there was no way for us to stay. We were like, yeah, we're going to start our own studio. So I said, the 4 of us are going to go start a new studio. And I remember Kurt saying, like, wow, that's really interesting. Like, if people need to get, if publishers or people want to get a hold of you, how can they do that? We didn't have an email, like we didn't have anything. So I just gave my cell phone number. Like my personal cell phone number, which got printed, like, right. So as we're, and then like 2 days later, we're at Dave Brevik's house, sitting in his front room, going like, okay, well, so I guess we're starting. Like we're all just like, I guess we're starting a company, huh?
I guess we're starting over.
What do you do? And from day one, it was like we want to do a 3D version of Hellgate, like a true 3D version. Procedural generation, humans versus demons, but our own world that we set. We'll set in a different timeline. It's not fantasy. London was very early on in like where we wanted to set it because we liked the lore and the history that was there. And like from very, very early on, that kind of spine of what became Hellgate in London was there. And the thing that I think was really interesting is that we just dove into it right away. We had people that were reaching out to us that we had worked with for a lot of years. And a lot of the guys, the Blizzard North guys, were like, "How happened? This is going to be miserable. Can we come work with you?" Right? And we had to be careful about how we did that. We couldn't approach anybody. We only talked to people when they approached us. We actually had them sign letters saying that they approached us, right? Because we weren't poaching, right? And anybody that we had a schedule of how many people we could actually hire from Blizzard from the first year, like, and how they could be hired and everything. Because these were the people that said, "Hey, we want to come work with you." And that's where we got, Phil Shank and Dave Glenn and Tyler Thompson and Peter Hu and like that, Ken Williams and like the kind of that core, like 12 of us that started Flagship. And we worked out of Tyler's house for the first like year. He had enough space to where the engineers were in the like kitchen area. Kenny and I were in their dining room, and then like Eric and Max and Dave and Phil they had a little like basement office area, right? So we're just like, okay, we're kind of on both things, and everything was out of pocket, and we all chipped in to pay Tyler's now exorbitant electrical bill, right? Yep. And things like that, until we could get a publishing deal and start making it. So it was just a company spawned out of necessity, right? Out of like what we completely anticipated happening was that Havas would come back and say, "We didn't realize this was such a serious issue. Like, we'll pick up the phone or we'll have an email with you," right? And really all they got out of it was like, "Oh, well, I guess these people want to leave.
Bye.
Goodbye," right? Which in very looking back retrospect, really probably shouldn't have been a surprise when Diablo 2 became the fastest selling game to 1 million copies, right? And got the Guinness Book of World Record for that on PC. Havas and Jean-Marie Messier, but Havas sent a congratulation email to Dave and Eric and Max and misspelled all their names.
Oh no.
Right. Their first and last names, and it was either a first or last name for all of them. And Eric and Max are brothers, so they have the same last name. And that was the funny thing is instead of Eric, which is ERICH, they actually put ETLICH. So we used to then from that point on, he was Etlich. We used to call him, "Hey, Etlich, how's it going?" So that was probably a very telling moment when it's like you're sending this big, massive congratulation letter for us doing something phenomenal, and you don't get anybody's names right.
Yeah.
So
that's fun.
So just to not run against time, if we can slip in one last question about the post, because after your departure, obviously, Fenix was a very remembered role, and in the second game, in Wings of Liberty, there wasn't any mention of him at all, and there was a huge fan backlash. And it got to the point where I'm sure you've heard they brought him back as like a robot. They brought him in Heroes of the Storm. But I'm curious if you followed that like community that loved that character specifically, or
I mean a little bit. Anytime that you get the opportunity to work on a character that really ends up resonating with people, you kind of always keep a little tab on what's happening. It was disappointing to see they didn't bring it back. I've always had good relationships with Blizzard. And the folks there, I have let them know, over the decades, like if you ever have a character that I've voiced before and you're doing them, I would love to come back and do the voice work. I think that's just a cool thing for fans.
Fans were a little upset in Heroes of the Storm when it wasn't.
And that was the thing, right? Even when they were like, "Oh, we're going to have him be in Heroes of the Storm," I was like, I want to come back and do Phoenix. And they were like, "Oh, we've got other." Okay, I I'm letting you know I want to do it. I'm asking to do it. It's ultimately your decision, obviously. But I think that I always view those as being really big missed opportunities, right? Where to have someone who's connected with a project, and especially when the fans know it, to come back and reprise a role or be involved, or to kind of show that continuity, right, in that way. And it's the kind of thing, and I know so many people that over the last 30 plus years have worked for Blizzard, some that are still there, some that have gone on to other things. And I find that there's always, at some level, for the vast majority of those people, not every single person, but for the vast majority of the people, there's always that little bit of like bleeding blue, right? You're always like, there's always some Blizzard that's always there. And I've had conversations over the years about, there was one time when I got a call and asked if I wanted to come back to Blizzard. And I was like, yeah, I would love to do that, especially what we were talking about me doing. And then they ultimately decided, like, actually, we think we're not ready to do that role, which was kind of disappointing. But it's that kind of thing where it's like, I still want the company to do well. It's painful sometimes to see where certain things have happened, what's happened. And
very painful, yes.
But it's because I'm always going to have a love for the company. It's where I got started, right? I owe so much of my career to the things I learned there, the things I was given the opportunity to do there. When I was there, we were absolutely a meritocracy. It was like, you got to try everything. If you're good at it, you have to do more of it. If you didn't, no harm, no foul. We're just going to move you to something else, right? Like, that's not your talent base. That's not your skill set. But then when they found things that you were really good at, they gave you that opportunity to thrive. So I still, to this day, I'll quote lessons that, either we made up while I was there or I learned, from Alan and Mike. So, it's always fun for me to like be on a show like this, talk about the history of the company, the history of the games, because it still, to me personally, has a lot of meaning.
Yeah, and it means a lot to us that, especially being able to talk to you about it. We're getting over time, but Mark, do you have anything else you wanted to?
Well, first off, I thank you so much for coming on, and I know a few years ago I emailed you about a StarCraft 2 mod that I would like to have you voice Fenix in.
I've never done it. I've never done that, right? I'm
terrible.
terrible.
It's okay. It's okay because I sent you the unit quotes and I never wrote the script yet. So actually, it's both of our faults. But
all right. Well, look, I'll say this now on the podcast so you can hold it over my head. But I've got all my home studio stuff set up because that was one of the things with COVID. We all had to like get our gear all set up, and I'm doing voiceover work again now. So if you send me script stuff, I will do it.
All right. I'll let others.
If you ever want to actually do that mod still or whatever it is.
There is a huge mod making scene still for maps, and there are people who would love to hear that.
That'd be great. It'd be super fun.
You're okay if I share your email to some of them or no?
To the mod folks? Yeah, sure.
Yeah, anybody that wants.
Yeah, I'll give you my work email, my new work email.
Sure. Yeah, no, I was gonna say the one that I'm using. I'm pretty sure it's not your work email. So.
No, it's not.
Yeah, okay.
It's my secret email that I can't have just people clogging that up. Otherwise, I won't get all my political spam.
Don't worry, man. I'll let you. I'll also message you if anybody wants to have you on.
That's absolutely cool. Yeah, that'd be really fun.
Yeah, man. No
all right.
So last question is one that we're going to ask every person ever that appears on here. What is your favorite race on StarCraft?
On StarCraft, I really have a soft spot for the Protoss. And that was because I think that, they were so challenging to make. Right. Because the Terrans were the baseline, right? They came out first. We knew what they were going to do. they were the rock or whatever, like in rock, paper, scissors. And then the Zerg were next, and we're like, all right, we're just going to amp everything up by 1,000. This is where people are going to see, like, I've never had that many units on the screen before. It's crazy, right? And there was a real tie-in initially, obviously, story-wise, between the Zerg, right, and the humans from like the get-go, right, with Raynor and the attack and everything. But the Protoss just were like so considered, coming up with, you know, a whole alien culture, right, and how they had that connectivity between them, and even from a balancing unit. So we're like, these are like the big hitters, right? Like we want them to feel very different when you play them, right? And having so much lore that went into them, you know. And then I think, you know, also just because I got to play Fenix, right? So that all ties in. I just like got a real connection with the Protoss. And I think, you know, where we ended up art-wise with them was just so cool, you know.
Very distinct.
You know, like very distinct, very different. And it's just one of those things where they just stand out, right? Like you see a Protoss and you're like, yep, I know exactly what that is.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they don't get confused with anything in a good way.
Yeah. Well,
Awesome.
That's awesome, man.
It's a great answer to hear. Well, it's been an honor to talk to you, Bella. It's been great.
We've
learned a lot.
Yeah. No. Hey, thank you guys. I'm really excited to be able to talk about this stuff. It's been great. You know, just going down memory lane. You know, on some of the stuff. It's really funny because there's this real, like this like memories will come up, right? And it's like, oh my god, I totally remember that. And then the thing that blows me away is the story is like, you're like, oh, this thing, and you hold up like the StarCraft deck. I'm like, oh my god, I totally remember that thing.
I'll have to send you my collection because I've got a lot of
I'd love to see photos, man. That'd be amazing. It's really interesting. I'm you know, to spend 30 seconds hyping a thing I'm not entirely involved in, but I got interviewed for is Play Nice that Jason Schreier wrote, right, which is kind of the rise falling for Blizzard Entertainment. Jason did a ridiculous amount of research. He talked to hundreds of people inside the company. And it was the same thing. Like, he would ask me things. I would talk about different things that happened or whatever it was. And then he would sometimes prompt us, like, hey, so I talked with such, and they mentioned this thing. And I'm like, oh my God, I completely forgot about that. You know, I mean, not only things that happened at Blizzard, but he follows a little bit of like what we did at Flagship and what some other studios that got started, right? And like one of the Flagships one, he's like, oh, he goes, yeah. And I was talking with, I think he was talking with Dave Brevik. He goes, he mentioned that you guys were hacked at one point and the FBI came in and investigated. I was like, oh my God, I totally forgot. Something that huge, I totally forgot that happened. Yes, that happened, right? You know, it's just that so many things occur, right? And when there are people like you guys that are very focused on preserving that history, right, and really delving into you know, the stories and things like that, I think it's super valuable, you know. And I'm really happy that that's where the video games industry is, right, at a place where that matters to people, and it's important that we keep that. And I think it's doubly important because a lot of what we do in the video game space becomes ephemeral, right? It's the fact that it's there and then it's gone. Like, those systems don't exist anymore. Those servers aren't up anymore, right? Even not like film or music, right? Where it's like, no, there's still copies of that exist. You know, even though technology has changed, I can still go back and watch Gone with the Wind.
Yes.
Right. Even though technology has changed, I can still go back and listen to music from the 20s or the 1800s because the recordings still exist. But there's games that are 15 years old I can't go play.
Yeah, no console. You gotta you need an emulation.
Yeah, no console, no bring forward. It's a client server game. The servers aren't up.
Yep.
Right, and it's just like we lose so much of that history. So you know, I thank you guys for doing this kind of podcast and this kind of work to make sure that these things are captured and shared, and, you know, hopefully continue to move forward in perpetuity.
Yeah, man.
Great.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on. Do you have any fun behind the scenes footage or files or anything you'd like to
I'll look to see if
share?
I've got any photos buried somewhere, probably
Videos.
on a hard drive. You know, I know I've got, you know, a couple things. Again, like I'd have to kind of go out and look in storage. I know I've got like, I don't remember what it might have been.
Pressure.
It might have been not E3. It might have been ECTS back when that was a show, European Consumer Trade Show that we all used to do, where it was really fun. There was, when StarCraft started getting awards, was the same time that Half-Life got awards. So strangely enough, at all the like shows and conferences and everything, I got to hang out a bunch with Gabe Newell, just because we were always like, we were the ones that accepted awards for the studios, and so we were always up for Game of the Year or something, right? And I know I've got some photos that they took after StarCraft won some awards someplace, and I'm like holding the StarCraft awards, like it was weird stuff like that. I'll see what I can dig up. If I can find some stuff, I'll send it your way.
Preserving those too is even just pictures of them is really valuable. And
yeah. All right, man. Well, it's nice chatting with you. Thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah,
you bet. Thanks, guys. It's been a blast.
Yeah, it's been great.
See you later.
Thank you.